All right, looks like we are live. So this is the Massage Therapy Journal Club. I'm Christopher Moyer. Today I am joined by my longtime friend and colleague, Ravensara Travillian, coming to us from the Seattle area. How are you today, Raven?
Doing good. How are you, Chris?
Pretty good. It's cold here today, but yeah, I'm good coming to you from Denver. Um, Raven, usually when I have a discussant on here, I have a bio prepared, but I didn't bother with that today because I have a pretty good knowledge of your background. For those of you who don't know Raven Sara, she is in no particular order, she is a biologist, she is a informaticist, she's a massage therapist, she is uh, delving into the worlds of cooking and baking and food science. Raven, we seem to have lost your video there. You still with
Okay,
us?
I'm getting an auxiliary plug in right now to make sure that I don't disappear.
Well, we can still hear you fine. So if you're able to devote the mental energy, do you want to tell us about your latest projects or anything you want to sort of bring some attention to right now?
Yes, I'm investigating doing a pizza farm. So I'm taking a class at Washington State University on agricultural entrepreneurship, and I'm learning to make pizza in the hopes of putting together an enterprise for my retirement years.
Far out.
So it'd be something like this is a concept that the Midwest is familiar with, but not so much out here. Although I hear there's one or two. Basically, people come out to the farm and it's casual. It's not a restaurant setting. It's more like a picnic setting, or maybe even less than that. But they come out and they buy pizza and have a good time on the farm.
And you're leaving out, I know you know this, but you're leaving out that, maybe a lot of the ingredients come from that farm. And we're talking about probably a wood oven sited there on the farm rather than sort of a building or right, like probably
Right.
out in the open. Yeah, yeah,
Right. A wood
pretty
oven sited there, and greenhouses with varieties of tomatoes, basil, oregano, and other herbs and spices to use on the pizza. So
excellent.
the idea, the classical Neapolitan pizza draws a lot on the volcanic soils of around Mount Vesuvius. So I'm interested in seeing what the soils out here do. The soils here are very nice for wine. Well, I could go on for hours and hours. I know that'd be really a distraction here, but it's
That's
really
all
good
right.
for wine and that kind of thing. I want to see how it does for heirloom tomatoes and the taste on classical Neapolitan pizza.
Well, when I'm ready to give up the wildly lucrative pursuit of massage therapy research, when I'm ready to let go of that, I am ready to come join you on your pizza farm. But
It's a
uh,
plan.
in the, yeah, well, it's something. In the meantime, you and I are here to talk about some classic research by the mid 20th century psychologist Harry Harlow. And for any of you who are seeing this feature for the first time, the article that we're going to be discussing is posted to my Facebook group and to my Patreon group. The Patreon link is in the description of this video. It also gives you an opportunity there to contribute to this production. I'm trying to make this a sustainable feature, and so that kind of support, even a very modest contribution, those add up if we can get a bunch of people doing that. So we're going to be talking about this paper from 1958 in which Harry Harlow describes a series of experiments that he did with infant monkeys to try to investigate the underpinnings of love and affection in ultimately what he's interested in as human beings, but he describes why it's not practical for numerous reasons to do the research with human infants. Um, how do you think we should start, Raven? How do you think we should start?
Well, I don't think we can assume that everybody's read the article yet. So maybe if you gave just a narrative overview of what they did and what they found and what they made of it, maybe that would be a good place to get everyone on the same page.
Sure. And, we do encourage people to read the article. And if you're not watching this live, you can pause it and go read the article. If you want to do the what we used to call Cliff Notes, but what should now be called Wikipedia, there's a very good Wikipedia file on Harry Harlow. And the thing that he's best known for is doing very, very experimentally controlled research in which newborn monkeys that are just a few days old, are separated from their biological mother and then are exposed to conditions, the best known one, uh, in which they have artificial mothers. So, in the most well known experiment, a newborn monkey is put in a position where it has availability to a mother constructed out of wire and another mother constructed out of soft materials. And depending on the experimental condition, one of those mothers may provide milk in the form of a bottle that's been attached to it. And so he's created this situation that is highly artificial, but which allows them to observe what will the monkey do, especially if the monkey has to make a choice between getting nursing or getting comfort in the form of soft touch and the ability to cuddle and snuggle. And there's a lot more details, as you would expect, but this is what he was doing. And you want to pick it up from there? Hand it over to you.
Yeah. One of the things I found really interesting about this study was when you look at things, I tend to envision biopsychosocial as a triangle. So there's one corner that's biological, and that's where things that are purely bio rest. Like if you got the gene for Huntington's disease, you're pretty much going to get the disease. There's nothing you can do to change that. Other things are less definitive, but that corner is where things that are exclusively biological fall. And then the other corner is psychological. And then the other corner, the third corner is social. And then everything else falls on a gradient made up of some amount of components of biopsychosocial. And the more you tend toward the biological end of things, like molecular biology, where you're looking at genes and proteins, the easier it is to do what we call a knockout study. You knock out a gene that's responsible for a particular function, and then you see what effect it has. And usually, as you get more toward the psychological or the social ends of things, you get more and more confounds and more things you have to take into account. But this struck me as almost like a knockout experiment on the psychological end of it. It's like
Yeah.
it was so clear the connection between what he did and the effect it had. You don't usually see that except in molecular biology, that kind of study.
Yes,
By the
I was, as you were saying that, I was wondering how you're going to make the connection back to the study, and well, for a moment I did, but you absolutely did, because you're exactly right. Because typically in psychological studies, you don't see this kind of experimental control and this kind of precision in isolating a variable. And so, he begins by saying that these infant monkeys are a perfect subject for this kind of research because within a couple days of being born, they have motor function, whereas a human infant can't really move its way around for weeks or months, depending on the level of motion that you want to see. These monkeys are able to move around very soon after they're born. And so in that sense, it's practical to do this kind of research with them to see where will they go and what will they do. And then the other thing he's doing, and we're just cutting right to it here, which is good, he is separating two things that in nature are never, ever separated. So if you think about mammalian mothering, if you have your biological mom, she is going to be warm and soft. Now, we'll set aside her behavior for a moment. Some mothers are better than others, but she's going to be warm and soft, and she's going to provide mother's milk. And so, if you want to ask the question, which of either of those is more important for forming a maternal bond, or which of those is more important for developing love and security in the infant, you're never going to be able to do that in a natural setting because those things are always linked. And he goes and he creates an experimental situation in which those are now able to be separated, which is what you were getting at, yes?
Yeah, I thought it was really insightful for him to make that distinction. It's easy for me at least to look back and say, "Oh, it's obvious," but I don't think I would ever have thought of it myself. He made it look easy, And it's such a profound idea, but nobody had thought of it up until now because it took such a conceptual leap to separate those things.
Yeah, and that's a thing that is always fascinated me about research is when a piece of research is so good that once it's been done, looking back on it, it feels obvious, right? It seems obvious to us now that touch and comfort and warmth would be fundamental to this. But before this research, the predominant way of thinking was that love, affection, is formed through the delivery of this primary need, that there is no love or affection in the infant until it gets that primary need of hunger satisfied. And his research shows really powerfully that that is not how it works.
That's interesting the way you phrased it. I was thinking of Maslow's hierarchy, and it wasn't until you and I were talking about this article that I knew about the connection between Maslow and Harry Harlow.
Well, let's say what that is. So people may not realize that the humanistic psychologist Abraham Maslow was a doctoral student of Harry Harlow. And, when I first read that several years ago, I was kind of struck by it. I didn't know it. And, on the surface, you look at Harlow, and Harlow looks like what he's doing is very, very behavioral. So he's coming from the middle of the 20th century when behaviorism is still a pretty powerful force in psychology, and he's doing animal research with super tightly controlled conditions. And everything about this speaks to, the behavioral tradition of Watson and Skinner and those folks who were not even concerned with mental states or with drives. They said, look, you cannot ever observe what's going on in the mind of any animal, including humans. And so there's no point in trying to do science on that. And if psychology is going to be a science, the things that we must concern ourselves with are observable behavior. And whether we want to try to, it's a fool's game to try to infer what's going on mentally. Some of the extreme behaviorists might have said there is no mentally, that isn't even a thing. I think most of them believed it was a thing, just that it wasn't a subject that could ever be accessed for science. And so on the surface, Harlow looks like one of those behaviorists, but in fact, he's kind of not. He's really he's filling the gap from pure behaviorism to the latter part of the 20th century, at which point psychology does start to meaningfully study mental processes through indirect ways, through inference, and so on. And we could say more about that if we need to. And then Maslow is considered one of the pioneers of humanistic psychology, which is concerned with what are the things that make human beings unique, what are the elements of psychology that satisfy our needs and values and purpose in life, which was a very powerful force in the latter part of the 20th century in psychology. And, to bring this all, to maybe start connecting this to massage therapy, which is what we want to do with this project, this piece of research does not involve any massage therapy, but we're going to talk about whether it has implications for it. So recently in my Facebook group, a lot of us were talking live in a lively fashion about whether massage therapy has any place in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Do you need massage, or do you need some element of what massage provides, or is it something that is a luxury or something that you want, but you don't strictly need it in the way you need other things?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good way to start bringing this around back to massage, because just as you were saying that about him bridging the gap, I was thinking a lot of the things we see in massage discussions online right now are clashes of ideas about the meaning of massage and the value and the worth of it. And that kind of fitting it into Maslow's hierarchy. I'm saying Maslow and you're saying Maslow. Do you happen to know, or is it, for me, it's just a reading word, so.
Yeah, well, you know languages, including probably Russian. I mean, as far as I know, it's Maslow, but
Maslow works. But anyway, so I see him as trying to, he's talking about meaning. And the discussion around it is people are talking about what is the meaning of it, what we do, and how does it relate to these things, and how do we fill a need for the clients if there is such a need. I think this is getting at basic questions about the profession. We're transcending questions of technique and trigger points and do they exist or not, and getting back into what is our value, what value do we bring to the relationship between us and clients. So I think it's kind of a straight shot. Maslow doesn't directly address it, but if comfort contact isn't a bridge into the topic of massage, I don't know what is, because comfort contact, I think, is a huge part of the value that we bring to the relationship.
So
I think it also, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think there's a lot of dots to connect between that, though. I think it's a big leap from that, through comfort contact, to the structured profession of massage therapy as delivered in modern 20th century America. So we've got a lot of dots to connect along the way, I think.
So let's not, we can talk about where we want, but let's not get too far away from Harlow's study. And you know, I may have taken us away from that in extending it to Maslow. So in the, you know, in the discussion we had in my Facebook group, in which I invited people to consider whether massage therapy could be considered a need. And for anyone not familiar with this, if you want to pause here and look up Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's one of the most classic theories in psychology, in which Maslow says there are 5 levels of things that we need or aspire to attain, and that if you're not getting your needs met at a level, that you can't aspire to the needs at a higher level unless you're getting your needs met at the next more basic level. So you will, as an example, you will compromise your safety to get food if you need food. You know, food is a more basic need than keeping yourself safe. And once you've got those things met, now you might aspire to love and belongingness. Okay, so you know, I posed the question, could we think of massage therapy as a need? And most of the respondents in that discussion said some variation of no. Some of them said no outright, but then some other people equivocated. They said, well, it's not a direct need, but we could see how elements of it could fit in anywhere in the hierarchy. And I don't want to sound like I'm putting that answer down. I think that answer is right to some degree. But I'm a little more interested in whether massage therapy is closer to being a fundamental need. Now, I don't think it by itself, formally defined, is a need. I think you can go your whole life without ever getting a session of massage therapy. However, maybe it is a form of something that is needed. So if we look at this research by Harlow, and he unpacks 5 or 6 different experiments in which he shows how these infant monkeys will go out of their way to pursue touch comfort. They will minimize their access to food, or as soon as they get their food need met, as soon as that's met, they're on the warm cloth comfort mother. And note that the warm cloth comfort mother isn't even alive. She isn't even doing anything. So where some people might say, well, that's artificial, I would say the artificiality of it is its strength and shows how important this is. She doesn't even move or massage them. She is just the most basic form of something like touch comfort. And these monkeys will cling to her 9, 10, 11, 12 hours a day. Or if something that is a little bit scary is introduced to their environment, they immediately run to this cloth mother and behave in a way that suggests to any reasonable person that they're getting comfort and security from being near her or being on her. And by the way, before I forget to mention it, if you go on YouTube and you search for Harlow monkey, you can find classic film clips of some of these things we're describing. And they're both fascinating and heartbreaking in a lot of cases, because these monkeys are sometimes so scared, so distressed in certain cases. So the thing that they use to scare the monkeys is basically a wind-up doll that like claps cymbals together. I mean, it's nothing that you or I would ever be scared of, but these monkeys who are days old and have never been in the natural world, this thing gets put in the cage and they are scared. I mean, it's really dramatic. Um, so to make the point that I'm probably taking too long to make here, Harlow's research here really strongly suggests that touch and the comfort that is derived from touch is a fundamental need. That's what I have to, go ahead.
I'd agree with that, and I have a macaque example to show. I know the plural of anecdote is not data, but this is an experience with a macaque with what I call touch hunger. I don't know if that's a technical word or not, but it's just what I use to indicate something I observed. I used to work at the zoo, and I would clean the monkey cages, and there was a young girl macaque. Can't give her name because that would reveal the zoo I was at. It would reveal that I touched her, which I wasn't supposed to be doing. But her mother rejected her. So she was raised by humans. And the idea behind raising her is we wanted to treat her as much as a wild monkey as possible. So we didn't like make her a pet or anything.
Yeah.
But Rhonda, I used her name. She came out of this.
I'm sure the cops are on their way to your house right now. They've been waiting for years for you to blurt out this monkey's name. Raven, you're ridiculous.
Yeah, well, anyway, this was 30 years ago.
Yeah, well, they got you now.
I know, it's on tape, me confessing. Anyway, so when I would clean the cage, she would reach out. She would do anything she could to touch me. She wanted touch that bad from somebody she didn't even know. And the only things that I really knew about it that made sense were she was rejected by her mother, and the humans deliberately chose a strategy that didn't involve engaging with her that much. So touch hunger in a macaque, I've observed it firsthand.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, the anecdote just serves to reinforce what Harlow found in the controlled research and that we've now known about for, 6 decades. So there is clear evidence in these infant primates that they need touch. So from that, are we able to extend that to humans, including adult humans? Because, we might be able to, and there's a clear research, it's not experimental, but there's a clear research with human infants and babies that they need touch. So there's some evidence to suggest that babies handled in the ICU gain weight better. I kind of put an asterisk on that because different researchers have reached different conclusions with that. If you read Field's research from Touch Research Institute, she's much more positive about that. If you read Vickers' meta-analyses of that, he says, well, the effect's pretty small, but he doesn't say that there's no effect. So premature infants seem to do better when they're handled. The strength of that effect, I think, is debatable. There is classic and, again, heartbreaking research from the orphanages in Romania and the surrounding areas. When communism fell, there were orphans who were abandoned and not handled and not interacted with. And there's all kinds of evidence that their development was very badly impacted by this. So I think we can very safely conclude that there is a developmental need for contact and handling, including we have some direct evidence in human beings. Can we say that that's the case in physically mature humans?
I can't say that I can prove this, but I do have the sense. I worked with a lot of older veterans who tend to be mostly male, And I've had a bad couple of years in terms of attrition. All of my World War II and Korean veterans have died off over the last couple of years. So I'm not working with that population anymore. But I always,
Could you, I mean, we could do the math here, but gentlemen who served in those wars, how old would they be now? World War II vets would be very old. So if they
yeah,
were,
in their 90s.
if they
I
were in
had
their,
vets in their 90s.
okay,
And
yeah,
the
that makes
Korean War
sense.
vets were in their early 80s, early to
80s.
mid 80s.
Okay.
Yeah. Nobody ever said anything like this. So I'm extrapolating. But I always got the vibe that they were not looking for sex from me, but they were looking for touch from someone who cared about them. But they could never say that because it's not something that men of their generation were enculturated to say, I need this. But if you could put it under the guise of treatment for something, I'm not touching this person just because I care about him. I'm touching him because he was shot down over Italy in 1943 and he still has pain from the airplane crash. So it's like they both needed touch, and it was hard to say that, but it was much easier to put it in the context of this is something I need, my doctor has prescribed
Oh,
it.
I see.
So yeah. So I think the need's there, but I think there's been a lot of enculturation against talking about it and against getting it met unless we medicalize it.
I see. Okay. So the need is there, but the only way that it can be rationalized is if it's in the context of my wonky shoulder needs treatment or something like that. It can't be, I need to be touched and handled because that's good for me.
Yes, and I'm talking about just a subset of the population here.
Right.
But I do think that men and women alike are being raised to be more vocal about what they do and don't need. So I think that this is changing. But I thought it was really interesting how none of them would admit to just wanting to be touched in a caring, non sexual way. But they all seemed to enjoy it very much when I did it. But they couldn't break down the barrier of asking for it because they really wanted it,
Interesting.
for what that's worth.
So that gets a little more at, the cultural prohibition that maybe is unique to that generation or more strong in that generation about, how it gets asked for or not asked for. But if we ask the broader question about, is massage therapy or something like it a need in human adults, how would we answer that?
From what I've seen, I think it's a need, but I don't think it's at level 0 or maybe even level 1. I think it's higher up the hierarchy, but without it, your quality of life suffers. And that we're talking about touch. We're not necessarily talking about massage therapy and all the rituals that go on around it, but massage therapy is a way of addressing a need for touch, which I see as kind of mid-level.
Yeah, I think I largely agree with that. And I've got this sense, and I can't really articulate it as scientifically as I'd like to. I sort of have this hunch, would be a better word, that it is a need. Um, and yet, asked to sort of formalize that or justify it or prove it, I can't quite do it. Um, but I mean, maybe this is where some revolutionary research needs to be done. Maybe we need to do research with human adults that really, in an experimentally strong way, tests that, and then maybe 50, 100 years from now, people look back on that and they say, "Oh, well, we always knew that." That would be. That would be nice. Um, well, you and I like these things to be open for us to discuss these in whatever direction they will go. And you and I have kind of left off from the Harlow paper and have gone to Maslow and have gone to modern day and have gone to treatment settings and so on. Um, Maybe we should once again, touch on what's specific in this research. Because one of the things, I was talking to Mark Olson yesterday a little bit, planning for a new one of these. And I told him that one of my goals for this series is to talk about research that is maybe potentially relevant to massage therapy, but isn't about massage therapy itself. I think one of the problems that we have is I think a lot of folks who are maybe new to science think think would be the wrong word. They maybe assume that research needs to be about massage therapy to be directly relevant or to be informative to massage therapy. And I don't think that's the case. I think there's so much research, like the paper we read today, that can maybe inform us about massage therapy or get us thinking about aspects of it in a new way. So, what else should we say about this research specifically? I mean, I can think of a couple things that we might want to touch on. We might want to touch on the ethics of it. We might want to touch on, related to the ethics, could you do this research today? Should this research have been done that way? We might want to talk about internal versus external validity. That's a fancy way of saying the difference between something that is very artificial in being an experiment versus the way research could be done in a real world setting.
I think we should get back to specifics about the study, but I want to make one last point about what you just said. When you're talking about a hunch or guesswork, Harlow also mentioned that in his study. He was talking about we guess this or we think this. And I was trying to look at this through beginner's eyes. And it struck me that if a scientist says in an article that they're guessing, then maybe that looks like guessing just any random person might do. But scientists' guesses are different. They're informed by a whole basis of what went before. So Harlow's not just making random guesses about what could potentially be true in a different universe. He's talking about what does the bulk of the evidence from all different disciplines point towards being as something likely that explains this. And Edward O. Wilson has a term consilience that refers to that. It refers to the fact that all the different disciplines of science, they all integrate with each other. We always talk in massage about integrating, but in science, we have an example of where things really are integrated. Chemistry agrees with physics. It's different, but it doesn't contradict physics. Biology, if something is said to contradict chemistry and physics, then we need to re-examine that because it's not likely to be true. So I think what you're talking about is using consilience to look for things to guide massage therapy that aren't strictly massage therapy research. And I think a lot of the fundamental research is what's needed to do that. I think in my
I agree with you. I think you've taken what I was saying and made it maybe even more highfalutin. Which is fine. I'm glad I can tease you like that. I want to use what you just said to draw attention to something really interesting that might have, you were just talking about how scientists make guesses, and I like the writing of a paper like this better than more modern scientific writing. Modern scientific writing in many cases is getting more and more formalized, harder to read. This article is doesn't get bogged down in that. And he's willing to say things like, we expected this to happen, but we didn't expect this to happen, right? You don't see modern papers written quite that way. But
well, there's pressures to produce. And
there's what?
There's pressures to produce and grants to compete for it all. So there's definitely institutional pressures working against the way Harlow was writing.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's true. But early in the paper, he mentions that this whole line of research came about through a chance observation. So they're doing research with monkeys, and they're researching something else. And I don't even know what it is, and he doesn't mention. Years ago, I read a biography of Harlow, and I can highly recommend the book. I don't have the author's name to mind, but the title is distinct. The title of the book is
Love at Goon Park.
Love at Goon Park, right. So if anyone's interested in this, it's a really interesting book. If you're wondering why it's called Love at Goon Park, if I remember right, the actual address of Harlow's lab was something like 900 North Park. And so if you wrote 900N quickly, it looked like Goon. And so they casually called the lab Goon Park. So he mentions, we were doing research with monkeys anyway, and in the course of doing this, we noticed that they would cling to the soft pads that were kept in their cage that were there for maintenance purposes. They're really basically diapers laying on the floor that are aiding in keeping the cages clean. And in the course of cleaning the cages and replacing the diapers, interesting things were observed. So it's not an experiment at this point. So the lab assistants come in, and that right there is maybe stressful for infant monkeys. Anything that changes, is going to be stressful. And then the person comes into the cage and starts mucking about and says, "Hey, little monkey, I need this." And the monkey's like, "No, no, I need this." And they can observe that, something's going on. So you don't have an experiment, but based on this chance observation, it launches a whole line of investigation that is done in experiments that turns out to discover something really, really interesting. And, as you know, a key to being a good scientist is being ready to notice things like that. Pavlov did the exact same thing, right? Pavlov was researching digestion in animals, and only through luck did they notice, oh, this is weird. The animals are salivating before we even give them any food. What's going on there? So, without going on a whole tangent about Pavlov, it's yet another example of scientists who are doing experimentation on one area, and in the case of doing that, they just luck into noticing this phenomenon they can't explain, and they say, well, that's interesting. Let's look at that formally. I'm sure you can say something about that.
Oh, well, there's an anecdote Isaac Asimov tells about how most scientific discoveries didn't come from someone doing an experiment which ended in eureka, but
Right.
instead, hey, that's funny.
Yeah, totally. That's absolutely how the most interesting things tend to come about when you read the history of these things. I wish I had more examples, ready to go, but just these two are so powerful. We're talking about two of the biggest names in psychology, in Pavlov and now in Harlow, who, the thing they're best known for was research that was kicked off by a chance observation.
Celia, too. We were talking about this last time we were in
Oh,
San
yeah.
Diego. But the way that Celia got onto the stress work is
For anyone who doesn't know what you're saying quickly, we're talking about the stress researcher Hans Selye, Selye. Go on.
Right. So anyway, he got anomalous results. He got results he didn't expect. And it turned out that the animals were getting stressed by the way he handled them, because he may have been brilliant theoretically, but he was not much of a lab technician. So he was
Right.
stressing them in trying to do something else. And that led to a whole line of discoveries about how stress operates in mammals.
Well, that's also a good example of incompetence turning out to be valuable. No, it is. It is. Because, and there are other examples of that in science. So, yeah, I remember that. And I remember Sapolsky talking about that at the San Diego Pain Summit, that Selye was not actually that good in, doing the field work. And that caused stress, and that, led to that. You can actually go back to the 1700s for an example of this, when astronomy had to be done by counting. If you wanted to see how quickly a star was moving through your star field, you had to literally line it up with your assistants with the telescope and count. And I don't have the name now, but one of the famous figures from that time started noticing that his assistants, some were good at counting at a steady rate and some weren't. And this introduced statistical error, which was like something no one had thought about before. They'd never really thought about measurement error. And that launched, a whole line of investigation in statistics and eventually in the, psychophysics. So yeah, it's when you see these things that you're not looking for and that you're not expecting that the most interesting lines of scientific inquiry are born. You and I are
Anyway,
you and I are just basically like riffing on the history of science now instead of talking about Harlow.
maybe we ought to do a new Cosmos, but maybe we should get back to the Harlow article.
Well, what about the ethics of this research?
Well, I think this research smacks us good and hard in the face with a basic reality. At the heart of it, I think, is sometimes we have to make difficult ethical choices if we want to know about things. So Harlow did some things that we consider through our modern ethics as horrible to these monkeys, especially since there was no way to make it right to them afterward. Nowadays, if you do something in a study, you often have to talk about, okay, so they're getting the control drug and the
So wait,
HIV.
let me interrupt. I apologize, but I think this is important. You're setting this up as our modern day view is that we know how bad this would be for the monkeys. But I'm going to stop you there because having read Harlow's biography hundreds of years ago, you know, if you go back to the time of Descartes and people like him convinced themselves that animals had no sensation, right? And they allowed themselves to do horrible things to animals because it was like, well, animals are just machines. Harlow didn't think that. And in fact, one of the things that's distinct about Harlow is he was fully aware and admitted that what was being done to these animals was horrible.
Yes.
And yet, okay, so he knew that. He didn't try to hide that, and he didn't try to sugarcoat it. He said, we're doing scientific research, and this is a price that must be paid.
Yeah, and I think that's a harder sell nowadays. Nowadays, we have a lot more regulations about what research can be done, and in some cases, we've declared things off limits that would have been accepted back in the 1950s. So I think a lot of people nowadays look at this research and kind of the shock at what was done to the monkeys kind of floods what of value came out of it. And I think we need to talk about that, just because the idea of, if we hadn't done this research, we wouldn't have gotten this knowledge. But yes, it's such shocking research. There was one guy, we talked about this the other day. One of his students came out to the University of Washington as a psychology professor. And so I thought, oh, this would be great. I'll call him up and see what he thinks.
Oh, you mean one of Harlow's students?
Yes, he was emeritus at the Dub. Sadly, I found his obituary. He passed away just this last September. But he is on record as saying that Harlow started the modern animal rights movement. And he didn't mean that Harlow was out there campaigning for animal rights. What he meant was Harlow's experiments and experiments like Harlow's caused such revulsion that this arose as a response to it. And it's something that I don't think we can ignore. I think at some point we'll all have to grapple with the question is, what is the price of getting knowledge, and are we ready to pay it?
And I agree with everything you're saying. You say, and are we, ready to pay it? But it's not we. Like, it's not you. It's not me. It's these monkeys.
Right, but as a society, we are making the decisions about who pays. But you're right, the monkeys are the ones paying. I actually dedicated part of my dissertation to the lab rats who took it in the shorts. My advisor asked me if I really wanted to put it in there, and I was, yes, indeed I do. But at some point as a society, we used to have more consensus that we were all okay with this. And now I think that the society has less consensus, and we're seeing that as a reaction against science and knowledge that comes from experiments that we consider shocking.
I'm totally conflicted about research like this. So I'm speaking, personally now. So in my fractured scientific career, I have never done research with animals. I've done research with human beings, but the nature of my research never really subjected them to stress. In fact, if anything, we gave them things they liked and wanted. So I've never directly been confronted with these kind of dilemmas. I value science incredibly highly. I'm very interested in it. I'm very familiar with studies like this in which animals were really, in some sense, tortured, depending on how you want to use that word. And I don't know if I don't think I could do this kind of research. I don't think I could be directly involved with it, but I stop short of saying it shouldn't be done or shouldn't have ever been done. I genuinely don't know what my position is on subjecting animals to difficult conditions in research. I genuinely don't know what my position is. I mean, I will
Well,
say, actually, I'll just add one more thing. It's a little more to that. I don't think it should be done lightly. I think if we're talking about the potential of making a major discovery that will benefit many, many people and maybe animals, or if we're talking about curing a disease, that's where the question starts for me. To me, it's still not an easy answer. If it's for something trivial, then the answer is easy. Then that's not
right.
right.
Lipstick's right off the table as far as I'm
Yeah, yeah.
concerned. You know, but things more like a life-saving drug that may or may not pan out. Where's the risk-benefit ratio that different groups of us? Because as you point out, there's no one we. I mean, we're splintered on this question. So I agree with you. The only animal experimentation that I ever did was being part of someone else's study where they took pap smears from bears. And the bears liked the treats. Basically, we bribed the bears, which was our version of informed consent. It's like if they didn't want to climb up and accept the bottle of molasses or honey, they were free not to.
That's
And in fact,
nothing like informed consent. That's not informed consent.
exactly.
You're going to confuse
In fact, when
people.
they saw us, yeah, when they
Animals
saw us
can't give
coming,
any.
sometimes what?
Go ahead. I was
I
going
was
to
going to
get
say
bogged down.
sometimes.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, sometimes when they saw us coming, they'd try to steer the process by assuming the ultrasound position, because that was a longer test and thus a longer treat. So it's like they were putting their own input into the research design. It's easy to do that kind of study. It's really, really hard to do what Harlow did, and I don't think I have it in me to do it either.
Yeah, no, I definitely would not be able to do it directly. But then it's another question of, do I think it is ethically justified? And I'm not sure.
I'm not sure either. That's the price of this knowledge. And so is this knowledge worth that price? I don't have an easy answer off the top of my head for that.
I wonder sometimes, you're right, that is the cost of attaining that knowledge. But I wonder, would we find creative ways to find that knowledge if we prohibited ourselves from doing this kind of research? That mental structure assumes there's no other way to get this information. But would we think more expansively and come up with other ways to get at it if we were forced to? That's something I wonder sometimes.
I think there's a possibility that it would happen that way, but I think we would always run into very real limits. If we're talking about, say, for example, using simulations instead of real animals, well, there's always going to be artificial intelligence has been very oversold over the decades.
Well,
Where
yeah,
we
that's
are,
nowhere near. We're nowhere near that point. Yeah.
no. So every solution I've ever seen proposed to it falls far short. I think for the realistic near term and medium term, we're going to be grappling with this question of, is it worth it? And the best we've come up to do is set up IRBs, institutional review boards, and other ways of assessing the ethics of it. And the NIH has gotten rid of most primate experiments. I think there's still some going on, but we've decided, as a government at least, that we want to get rid of primate studies to the degree that we can. So yeah, Harlow wouldn't get permission, I don't think, nowadays to do the study he did.
Well, I don't think he'd get permission to do this study, but what you just said, I don't know the degree to which that's true. I mean, there's an entire primate research laboratory, the Yerkes laboratory, that is still in existence as far as I know. See, I'm not prepared to talk about that. I mean, I have a hunch that there's still primate research being done. It's just what you can do is much more limited than before.
That's it. Yeah, that's what I was trying to get at. It's like you really have to justify it more, and you have to show that you can't do it any other way. Whereas before, anybody with 30 rhesus macaques had a research lab.
So to spin this back to massage therapy, one of the things, as you well know, as you and I have discussed many times, and as people have sometimes seen us bemoan in social media, for real, to get a job as a massage therapy researcher in academia is pretty close to impossible. I'll stop short of saying it's impossible because we know a few people who are doing it. I did it in a very limited way for a very short amount of time. You've dabbled with that, but it's very, very hard. It's not like you open the ads for professorships and they say, we're looking for someone who studies massage therapy. That literally doesn't exist. There is no such ad, and I can say that with total confidence because if it existed, I'd have known about it. Something that I have thought about, you know, is where should massage therapy be housed in academia and how should it be thought of? So for a long time, I pursued it in terms of looking for psychology positions. I'm most interested in the psychological aspects and especially the psychological outcomes of it. You know, I'm most interested in how massage therapy can be used to reduce anxiety. And I never got any traction with that for a number of reasons. And it's only more recently that I started to think, wow, maybe I should have tried to find positions in a biology department. That I should have been looking at ads that said, we're looking for a primate researcher. And it probably wouldn't have worked. But should we be trying to get in those positions and say, I'm a primate researcher, I'm studying social grooming in Homo sapiens. Now, I don't know if you'd ever get an interview for that, but thinking back, I wish I'd thought of that, 10 odd years ago as a way to try to get in.
Mm-hmm. I think there's more room for it in biology or in nursing than there is in, say, psychology or physical therapy. The physical therapists have shown that they don't really want to focus on massage, even though it is in their scope of practice. But the nurses used to do it. It used to be part of a nursing, and then that got crowded out by the other responsibilities that they have and the paperwork and the limited time and the stratification of different kinds of nursing roles. But yeah, I do think we've been barking up the wrong tree. I think biology and or nursing would be.
Well, those are so different. Places. And I applied for a position or two in departments of nursing, and I think there's all kinds of, but if we're talking about nursing, we're talking about something very, very applied. Whereas if we're talking about biology, we're necessarily talking basic, right? No one in a biology, I'm talking about coming in and sort of, giving a wink and saying, I study primates. Mm-hmm. By which I mean human beings, which is not what they're advertising for, but technically you're right.
I missed that when you said it before. That went whoosh right over my head. But it's a good point. So I thought you meant like Sapolsky studying baboons.
No, I meant what I used to do, studying human beings and trying to, jam my way into a biology department that way, which again, I don't think would work, but the other way didn't work either. So, I mean, maybe the odds would have been better, but I think again, I think it gets at this, massage therapy research as a field that I think so often the people who are connected to it are limiting their thinking to applied research and are limiting their thinking to massage therapy research is research that has massage therapy in it. And it is, but we needn't limit ourselves to that we ought to be pulling in basic research. We ought to be connected to people who are studying haptic perception. We ought to be connected to people who are studying the social psychology of healing environments, and that all of these things, I mean, this is both a good and a bad thing. On the one thing, it shows how interesting and interconnected massage therapy is as a topic of research. At the same time, it shows how massage therapy research doesn't clearly belong to any particular academic department, which is why the opportunities to do it, I think, one of the opportunities to do it are so limited.
Right. It's in nobody's particular budget, so it's hard to find where it fits in. But this ties back to what you were talking about before, discovering things by chance. If we treated massage research in a more basic science way, there would be room for serendipitous discoveries like that. Whereas in clinical trials, it's very narrow, very focused, very looking at what we're trying to do. sometimes things come up. I'm not trying to say that, you never make unexpected discoveries. I've seen trials of AIDS medication cut short because the drug was so effective that it's like, it's unethical to keep people on the placebo any longer than this.
Right.
Or there's another one, there, hormone therapy. The women who were getting the treatment were dying at such a rate. It's like, oh my God, we're killing our subjects. Let's end this trial. I'm not saying that never happens, but I'm saying in basic science, there would be more room for serendipity and discoveries of the kind like the cloth diaper, whereas in the clinical trial that it tends to be channeled into, it's not as welcoming an environment for that.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that the basic science opens up a little more space for fruitful observations that aren't that don't speak to the hypothesis being tested. Yeah, I think you're right. I'm gradually getting some feedback from people that when possible, we should make these episodes shorter rather than longer. I mean, I can go on talking about this stuff all day, but I know you can too. So we're approaching the hour mark, and I don't want to round it off just yet. There's one more thing that I want to make sure we talk about before we sign off, and that is the difference in language and in perspective as it relates to sexual identity and sexual roles. So, there are at least 2 or 3 instances in this paper where Harlow phrases something in a way that makes me cringe a little bit. So actually, I have one right to hand here. So in only the 3rd paragraph, he says, thoughtful men and probably all women have speculated on the nature of love. And I read that and I go, oh my Lord, did he really write that way? And if so, what exactly does that mean? Is that as subtly condescending as it sounds, and I'm not even going to try. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was expecting a mother-in-law joke to follow that one. It's just of the time and of the style, but
yeah, and
Harlow really is, I think, an outstanding example of where we have to separate the language from what the message really is underneath that language. Because, yeah, I sprained my eyeballs rolling my eyes at the language in a couple of places. But if I rejected the article for that reason, I would get away from the conclusion at the very end that there's no reason to keep women chained in the house under the pretext that infants need them for nursing. This is actually an argument for equality in the workforce, but it's couched in such language of his time. By the way, 58 was the year I came out too. So it's like, this is the world I was born into. So it's couched in the language of that era. And if we let that distract us from the message, which is underneath the language, then we lose a lot of value. And I think that gets back to what we were talking about earlier about our shock at what happened. Is this knowledge worth it or not? There is knowledge underneath our reaction to that. And I think the same for language.
Yeah, I posted some quotes on my personal Facebook page last night as I was finishing my preparation for this that I knew taken out of context would be a little controversial. In which Harlow says in his concluding paragraphs, he says something along the lines of, based on the findings in this research, we can say that men have all the requisite equipment for parenting as do mothers, something like that. I'm not quoting it directly, but something like that. It's in the paper. And I knew if I just posted that in isolation, some people would be like, what? How can he put down mothers that way? But if you, and again, not to take away that some of his language is just, of a different time. However, yeah, I want to reiterate what you just said. One of the really, really interesting things that he says in the concluding paragraphs is that these findings open up a more liberated way to look at parenting. That if early on you said, yeah, we take these findings for granted now, but if we take ourselves back to before this period in time, people reasonably assumed that the act of nursing was fundamental to the psychological development of the child. Now, set aside some of the biology that we know about nursing now. There's been good research to show that nursing rather than feeding a child formula has beneficial effects, such as helping develop the immune system and so on. So I'm not talking about that or disputing that. I'm talking about the act of the baby being held to the breast to suckle. It was assumed, it was essentially, Mook, one of my favorite writers in psychology, he called it the Mother Hubbard theory of mothering, that because mom is a cupboard full of food, this is why the baby loves her, right? But that's why, literally why, that if mom didn't provide food, that warmth would never develop. And, the psychoanalysts of that day, if they learned that you weren't suckled that way, they would go, oh, well, this individual is going to be a cold, demented person in adulthood because they didn't, connect the mother as the source of food. But he's saying, no, that's nonsense. He's saying we can see that that's nonsense, that what is fundamental is the handling and the warmth and the care, and dad can do that too, right? It doesn't matter that dad's not a source of milk or can't be unless he's got a bottle. That what's important is the handling. And that also, if we can put the milk into bottles, which we can do, that means that dad can nurse the babies too and have that opportunity for handling. And then that frees up women to leave the home and not be as tied to nursing the baby as they previously were, which is not to say that everything associated with that is not a monumental responsibility. I'm not disputing that. But he shows in his research beyond doubt that this effect is clear and strong. I mean, we should say that too. We're not talking about a pattern of research results where it's like, what's going on here? How can we interpret this? We're talking about like one line is here and the other line is here, right? It's like the baby given a choice, the baby monkey given a choice between milk or cuddling, it chooses cuddling all the time, as much as it can, until it's gotta have milk. And then it goes and gets milk and then back to cuddly mom, like all day long. And there's a famous photograph from one of Harlow's trials where the wire mother with the bottle of milk is here and the cloth mother is here. And the baby is clinging to the cloth mother and drinking off the nipple of the wire mother. It's like it illustrates so clearly that the baby is like, I want to be here and I'll do the absolute minimum I need to do to get the milk over here. So his pattern of results is just indisputable. The interpretation of it, you could maybe make more than one interpretation of it, but the strength of the effect is, jaw-dropping. It's indisputable. So the conclusion he reaches, which is a very liberated one, in my opinion, his wording leaves something to be desired by our modern standards. So much so that read casually, you could reach the wrong conclusion. You could reach the conclusion that he's saying, oh, moms, you're not that important. Or, or you could just assume he's, taking the stance, the implicit, 50s stance of, men are more important than women. And he's not doing that. He's using the language of his time, but the message that he's delivering based on his findings is a very modern one.
Yeah, I was struck by that when I read the article. I had seen the findings referred to a lot, but I had never actually read the article itself until you sent it to me for this presentation. So I was struck by that, and I liked the way he lined it up. And like I said, I was rolling my eyes at some of the language in it, but I think the message was right on point.
And how about we conclude with sort of a question and not even attempt to answer it? Let's just put it out there. So one of the last things, are you good with getting ready to conclude? Do you have anything burning?
That works for me.
All right.
Nope.
Okay, so he makes that point. Oftentimes we see there's controversy in massage therapy about male therapists and female therapists. So there's this strong preference among clientele or patients for female therapists. Sometimes it goes unspoken. It might have, I'm going to speak very cautiously. It might have something to do with sexuality. It probably does, but maybe not in all instances. It might also have to do with people's implicit assumption that females are the more caring of the two sexes. It might have to do with homophobia, where men have just been enculturated to not touch or be touched by other men. I wonder if there's anything in his conclusion about that that could be extended to the conversations about being massaged by men or women, and if it makes any difference, and how we ought to, how the profession ought to talk about and think about that.
It's a really good question.
Thanks.
I think that ought to provoke a lot of discussion.
Let's throw that question out there and not answer it and run away from it and see what people say.
All right.
Well, let's round it off there. Raven, I want to thank you very much for your time. And as you and I always do, I enjoyed talking about all kinds of things with you. You and I are never at a shortage for words. And
True.
you know, let's find occasion to talk more about pizza sometime too.
Let's do it. I enjoyed it very much too. I thank you for inviting me.
Sounds
I look
good.
forward to seeing the discussion that comes out of this.
Yeah, I agree. Likewise, I think there will be some discussion from this one. All right. Well, you take care, and I'll see you online.
All right. See ya.